Hi, I want to welcome everyone. My name is Michelle Novello. I'm the program coordinator for Providence Community Library. I want to thank, what's that? I want to thank you for joining us tonight. We're proud to host this important three-part series on the struggle for African Americans to achieve civil rights entitled Power, Privilege, and Social Justice: The History of American Civil Rights in Providence, Rhode Island. We're grateful to our sponsors and our cherished partnership with Rhode Island Black Storytellers and Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. This hour-long event begins with a short story from Valerie Tutson, then a 45-minute presentation by Keith Stokes with a short Q&A afterwards. Please know that all attendees will be muted, but you're encouraged to send your questions throughout the lecture via during the Q&A session. Since there are many people attending this event, we'll do our best to respond to your questions tonight. And the last slide in the presentation will show you how to contact Keith directly if you have further questions or if your question didn't get answered. The last slide will also show a link to the Providence Community Library website, which has a wealth of resources on racial and social justice issues. Remember to sign up for the next two lectures, and please fill out your response matter funding efforts to offer such programs for free and to help make our programs the best they can be. In that email, we will include links to the recording of this presentation along with a link to our list of resources. So we're going to start now with a relevant and poignant story by Valerie Tutson, a founding member and executive director of Rhode Island Black Storytellers, who is legendary not only in Rhode Island, but around the world with her powerful storytelling and firm belief in the need for all people to tell their story and be heard. Here's Valerie.
Good evening, everyone. It is my privilege and honor to be a part of this amazing project, Black History Matters: Power, Privilege, and Social Justice: History of African American Civil Rights in Providence. It is something that is near and dear to my heart and my work as a storyteller, and certainly core to the mission of the Rhode Island Black Storytellers. So thank you for letting us be a part of this. I want to begin with a song that has been brought to our organization and that we share wherever we can by a friend of ours named Masanko Banda, who's from Malawi in the eastern part of Africa. The words mean, "I see you and I greet you with respect." And since we're starting with things African tonight, it seems just right that we would begin in this way. Also believing that if we could all live by the words of this song, we'd have a very different world. So from Masanko Banda to me to you. Dakuona, 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 moni. I see you with my eyes and my heart in front of me, you fellow human, and I greet you with respect. I want to start with a story that comes from Africa. It's got different versions in different parts of the continent, and the way I'll tell it to you this evening goes like this. Once, long ago, they say that on an African night, the lioness had gone out for her hunt, and so the lion was keeping watch over the rest of the cubs and all of the other lions, making sure that the entire pride would stay safe. And off in the distance, they could hear some noise. And so the lion got up and the cubs crept behind him. And pretty soon they found themselves coming upon a campfire. And they stayed there in the shadows and they watched. And as the cubs looked over the big lion's shoulder, they could see that gathered around that campfire there were hunters, men who had been out with big guns all day long. And they had their catch all around the fire. And they gathered themselves close and they were eating and drinking and telling stories. And as the cubs and the big lion listened, they heard story after story of the hunters telling how they had chased down these mighty lions and captured them, and how they had chased this animal and that animal, and always they were the ones who were victorious. And when the cubs had been listening for a while, they turned and they asked their father, lion, "Father, why is it whenever those hunters talk about their fights against the lion, they always win?" And the big lion turned and looked at the cubs and said, "Aha, my children, it will be that way until the lion tells the story."
Thank you, Valerie. I now have the privilege of introducing our presenter, Keith Stokes. Keith is widely known for his extensive knowledge and tireless research on topics such as tonight, and has received numerous awards for his work, including, along with his wife, Teresa Guzman Stokes, the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities Prize for Creative Achievement in the humanities. Keith is a frequent lecturer, both nationally and locally, with an expertise in early African and Jewish American history. He has served on numerous regional and national historic preservation boards and appears on historical programs including C-SPAN, Fox News, and TED Talk. We have posted a more comprehensive bio on our website because he has a lot to list. So Keith, we're really honored to have you here tonight. It's all yours.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Providence Community Library and the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society for sponsoring this, and always our friends at the Rhode Island Committee for Humanities. I mean, it's been such a great partnership, and we're very excited to present this interpretation. As Michelle had said, this is a three-part series that we've developed under the title Power, Privilege, and Social Justice, and it really focuses on the evolution of civil rights for African Americans in the city of Providence and state of Rhode Island. Tonight, I'm going to spend time in part one talking about the early arrivals of Africans and how they evolved from enslavement to freedom and how they resisted both slavery and discrimination at that time. And the second part will go into the 19th century, and then we'll finish up in the third week with the 20th century, even to the present day, on issues of social justice. And again, I'm very excited to present this, and much of this information is going to go a long way, and I think bringing us together as a great state and great city. I'd be remiss if I did not recognize that the images that you'll see, much of the research that has been brought together, comes from a number of historical institutions in the state of Rhode Island, from the Black Heritage Society, Rhode Island Historical Society, Newport Historical Society, and many others. One of the things that we sometimes take for granted in Rhode Island is the fact that we have some of the largest and deepest and diverse collections of early American history right here in Rhode Island. And it's just been a pleasure to work with these institutions and just share just a piece of the many things that they have right here within their collections within our great state. I think it's important that I kind of set the stage of how I'm going to present this history. And I'm presenting the history in I think, a unique way, in a very important way. And it very much ties into Valerie's beautiful story. As the lion has spoken, we now are going to provide Rhode Island history through the eyes and the voices of African heritage people. And I think it's important now that as we're in the midst of a worldwide Black Lives Matter and social justice movement, I think this is the right time for African heritage history to be presented. And most importantly, I think it's important that we recognize the fact that out of all the collections that we have and documents and primary sources, many of these reflect the actual voices and experiences of Africans and later African Americans in Providence and across the state of Rhode Island. And I just have a firm sense that the more that we can learn from these men and women and families of the past, I think the better we'll be as we begin to organize ourselves to the struggles of the 21st century of social justice and equality. So my starting point's an important starting point because it's absolutely essential that all of us recognize that Black history did not start with slavery or the European colonization of Africa. The continent of Africa had existed for centuries as a well-organized, established societies of civilizations. In fact, in West Africa, which has a significant influence on the settlement of Rhode Island, there are a number of African kingdoms that were well in place and well established before European colonization, including the Ghana Empire, the Mali, the Kingdom of Uri, Yoruba, and the Akan Empire. It's also important to recognize that the Africans in West Africa, particularly in what today we recognize as the Gold and Guinea Coast and Windward Coast, they were already well established as merchant traders themselves, as trade members, as tradesmen, and they were involved in a whole wide variety of skill sets, from blacksmiths to weavers to leather workers, silver and goldsmiths. All these things were clearly in place and well organized well before European colonization. And later in the presentation, you'll see where that connection is absolutely essential, because these Africans that arrived here did not arrive as a blank slate. They brought with them to the Americas their culture, they brought their language, their religion, and their labor. I think it's important to recognize these early arrivals came through the transatlantic slave trade. And one of the things that we've been able to do is to be very careful in documentation of how the Africans arrived, where they arrived, and why they would arrive. Between 1705 and 1807, there are at least 934 documented slave voyages from Rhode Island merchants. Now, that could clearly mean that there are more, but what we have documented, and this documentation comes from the National Archives, Slave Fest Manifest, and other existing documentation. And what we have found is that out of those 934 documented voyages over about a 100-year period, they transported over 100,000 enslaved Africans, largely to the West Indies and some to Rhode Island. To give you a very thorough breakdown of that 934 voyages, 672 came from Newport alone, 167 from Bristol, 71 from Providence, 21 from Warren, and 3 from Tiverton, North Kingston, Little Compton. What's most important to recognize is that during the colonial period, Rhode Island, the colony of Rhode Island, Little Rhode Island, is at the very center in leading the slave trade in British North America. That 100,000 that arrived through Rhode Island ships represents just about 10% of the over 10 million Africans who would arrive through Portuguese, Spanish, English, Dutch, and other carriers. And as I said earlier, we now know that the Africans that arrived to colonial Newport in Rhode Island came via the Gold, Guinea, and Cape Coast of West Africa, in many cases via the West Indies. And in Rhode Island's case, it's Barbados in the 17th century and then Jamaica through the 18th century. And as I said before, and I will emphasize this throughout the presentation, these Africans arrived as forced immigrants, meaning that they came with their labor, but also with their religion, language, foodstuffs, and cultural traditions, all the things that have become a fabric of the history of Rhode Island and really the history of the Americas. And just to further emphasize the importance of Rhode Island in this transatlantic trade, this is one of the 934 documented sailing vessels, the Sanderson, that left from Newport in 1752. And as you can see in this map, it leaves Newport and the ship is carrying over 8,000 gallons of rum in some African short bars or iron bars. Rum was the monetary used to trade and capture and transport enslaved Africans. So it was rum that was produced in Newport, distilled in Newport, transported to West Africa, and then traded for enslaved Africans who in turn were taken from West Africa, largely the Gold Coast, and then through what we now call the Middle Passage to Barbados in this case, where they were offloaded and they became the workforce and labor force in largely sugar plantations in the West Indies. And then from the West Indies, the ship would carry sugar, molasses back to Newport, and that sugar and molasses would be the important product that would be distilled and carry Rhode Island into the leadership role in the transatlantic slave trade. Now, one of the interesting aspects is that when the slave trade was literally shut down and made unlawful by 1794 and again by 1807, several Rhode Island merchants, particularly the DeWolfs and Bristol, continued illegally trading. While they were not sending ships directly to Africa on a consistent basis, we do find them sending ships to San Juan, Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, which is Haiti, Dominican Republic, and Cuba. And then from there, illegally transporting those slave Africans to Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina. So what's important to recognize is that the first half of the 18th century, the transatlantic slave trade is dominated by merchants in Newport. By the end of the American Revolution and going into the early 19th century, it's Providence, but it's really dominated by the DeWolf family of Bristol. But in total, Rhode Island is the leader of this transatlantic slave trade, at least within British North America. And possibly one of the most important touchstones or historic sites that still exists that represents the actual men, women, and children that survived the transatlantic trade and are a part of all the aspects of the diaspora, from the West Indies to West Africa to Rhode Island, is a place in Newport called God's Laker. It's a burying ground which is today the oldest existing and largest existing cemetery that includes enslaved and free African heritage people dating back to 1705. And in fact, as you can see on the screen, we have a Cujo Lopez, who's a part of the Aaron Lopez household. In the center is an African woman named Violet, and she's married to Cape Coast James. Cape Coast is a part of the slave fortresses along the western coast of what is today Ghana. And then the final slide, which is our oldest marker, is a man named Hector, who is a servant who was enslaved to Anne Butcher of Barbados. He actually died 300 years ago in August of 1720. So if anyone has a chance, and they have not, please come to Newport and please explore and visit God's Laker. You'll actually see the physical remains of history before your eyes. I want to be able to talk about, in context, the business of slavery in Rhode Island, particularly in lieu of the issues that are going on today. There is a discussion today, and before the voters, there'll be a discussion removing plantation from the name of Rhode Island. There's lots of discussions about what were Rhode Island participation in slavery and what were enslaved Africans actually doing in Rhode Island. Well, what we know is that by the middle of the 18th century, Rhode Island was not only one of the most active participants in the transatlantic slave trade, but Rhode Island, only behind Connecticut, had one of the largest populations of enslaved Africans. Most of those Africans were enslaved and living and working and worshiping on either the plantations of what at the time was Narragansett County, then Washington County, today South County, or in the urban seaports of probably Bristol, Newport, and Providence, and then smaller groups scattered around Tiverton, Little Compton, and other areas. But what's before you here is a very important document because it really provides a clear, detailed understanding of Rhode Island's position at that time in the transatlantic trade and its dependence on that trade. In this document, which comes from our state archives, Rhode Island Governor Josias Linden is sending a letter to, at the time, the British Lord Commissioner of Trade and Plantations, and he's very concerned about the fact that this new Sugar Act, which would be established, which was a revenue-raising act by Parliament, placed upon the British colonies, and specifically on the transport of sugar and byproducts from sugar, such as molasses and rum. This would have devastating consequences on Rhode Island. And in fact, what Josias Linden says in his letter, and I've highlighted a few points, he first points out the fact that Rhode Island as a colony is no larger than 30 square miles. And it's greatly barren, its soil barren of any value as an agriculture-based economy. In fact, he says that our economy is nearly completely driven by molasses, which serves as the engine in the hands of the merchants of Rhode Island. And he goes on to say that as early as 1723, it's the Rhode Island merchants who introduced rum to supplant the French brandy, which is the chief commodity of trade for enslaved Africans. And then he brags at the end that, by the way, we have 30 distilleries in our colony, Rhode Island, 24 in Newport alone, and we are producing about 80% of the Guinea rum in the world economy at that time. So what he's saying very clearly is that this taxation without representation on the colony Rhode Island, which would eventually lead to the American Revolution, it's not just simply taxation on representation on a colony, it's specifically a tax imposed upon Rhode Island's singular economic dependence on goods and products intricately linked to the transatlantic slave trade. And again, in 1768, an anonymous letter to the editor of the Newport Mercury, a man that calls himself a true son of the liberty, very, very clearly points out, if you say you have the right to enslave Negroes in Rhode Island because it's to your interest, why do you dispute the legality of Great Britain's enslaving you? So this letter, and many letters like it, makes it a clear case that the reason that at least Rhode Island would separate itself from England, the reason that Rhode Island saw taxation without representation unfair is because it directly and deeply impeded its transatlantic slave trade system. And one of the things about Josias Linden as governor, and this is kind of an irony that I want to point out, is that a year later, One of his servants, a Caesar Linden, who originally lives in Newport, then later relocates to Providence. Caesar Linden is quite literate. He's actually a clerk on behalf of Josias Linden. His diary, which exists today as a part of the collections, the Rhode Island Historical Society, is one of the earliest diaries written by the hand of an African man, enslaved and later free, that accounts for day-to-day life over a 3-year period of an African in America. And in September of 1765, Caesar and his wife Sarah, their young son Pompey, dies of what he calls the bloody flux. That boy is buried in Newport at Gods of the Laker, and the marker, which states very ironically that in memory of Pompey, a beloved servant of Josias Linden, who died September the 11th, 1765. But what's most important about interpreting the documentation from an African perspective, he did not die as chattel property. Even though Josias Linden in his marker sees him and etches in the stone that he is property, he is a servant, he's enslaved, it is the diaries of his father, Caesar Linden, that reminds us that this was a beloved child, a human being, more than chattel property. And I want to talk a little bit about what West Africa was like, and particularly today, Ghana, as the Africans have been literally captured and transported through the Middle Passage to enslavement. What we now know is that, again, stepping back, Rhode Island is established as a British colony. We are part of British North America, so we're trading with other British colonies and settlements. In the West Indies, it's Bahamas, Jamaica, Barbados, Antigua. In West Africa, it's almost exclusively in what is today Ghana along the Gold Coast, and we're exclusively trading for enslaved Africans on a number of the slave fortresses. Two of the most important slave fortresses are the Cape Coast Castle, and then 30 kilometers to the south, Fort William at Ananabo. In fact, it is Fort William at Ananabo has the greatest involvement in Rhode Island merchants and slave traders. In fact, Rhode Island merchants are so active along Ananabo and Fort William, they're actually not only bringing goods and products to trade for slaves, they're actually outfitting the mahogany furniture in the slave fortresses of the owners and the captains. So many of the Africans that arrived via Anabo hailed from the Akan people, which includes the Ashanti and Fanti tribes. In fact, we've been able to interpret very carefully the records there that it is the Fanti tribes who are the coastal leaders who are actively trading with Rhode Island merchants and ship captains. And they are trading fellow Africans. It is the Shantis in the inlands who are capturing Africans after battle and seizing tribal assets, marching them to the coast, placing them in chains in the fortresses, and then trading them to the Fantis, who in turn trade them to the English ship captains to be taken away forever in enslavement. But what's most important that we recognize today, because we want to peel back the slave system and begin to understand the enslaved people, the African people. In fact, one of the things that I keep reminding people in history is slavery is not Black history. Black history is how African heritage people survived and persevered despite slavery. And one of the most important touchstones that we have in Rhode Island of that perseverance is the fact that many of the Africans that were born at that time of the Akan people would follow a very important tradition called day naming. So at the time of your birth, being a boy or a girl, you were given a day based upon the day of the week or in sometimes your birth order. In Rhode Island, those Africans that are largely arrived via the Gold Coast would bring with them or reclaim later that day naming tradition. So in our case, if you were a boy that arrived in Rhode Island and you were born on Friday as the Akan people, as an Ashanti or a Fanti, your day name was Kofi, K-O-F-I. We would anglicize that, or phonetically we would spell or call that Cuffy or Cuff. There are thousands of Cuffies or Cuffs all across colonial New England, and particularly in Rhode Island at Providence and Newport. If you were a girl born on Saturday, you were Mimba or Mimba. What's most important to recognize is that these day names have become embedded in the history of early Africans who once lived, worked, and worshiped in colonial Providence, Bristol, Newport, or Narragansett County. And here's just a list of some of many of the African day names that for a variety of reasons were not known or not recognized in their African connections. We know that today and we can celebrate that today. one of the most important aspects of these Africans arriving is that they were not passive. They did not take their captivity standing down. They looked to resist, and one of the most consistent forms of particularly New England resistance was not simply just running away, but running away and hiding and living what we call plain sight. Because again, it's 1760, you're an enslaved African in Rhode Island. You're certainly not running away and going south. Your options of going north are limited. So if you're going to run away in New England, one of the things that you were looking to do in a pragmatic and a logical way was to take advantage of the sea. The sea is very much tied to slavery. The sea was the internet of the 18th century. That's where you transported goods, products, information. Seamen would bring information about the ports that they settled in, what was going on, what was not going on, where a free African could go, where they could live, work without the issues of slavery. And what we find is that by the middle of the 18th century, the maritime industry, particularly in New England, became a meritocracy where they hired anyone and everyone, regardless of race or ethnicity or religion. It was a very dangerous trade, and you were losing vessels on a consistent basis, particularly transatlantic vessels. So what we find by looking at the scholarly work of a number of scholars, certainly Blackjack's African in the Maritime, Jay Coutry's Notorious Triangle, what do we find? We find that in Newport's case alone, close to 21% of all the crews of Newport sailing vessels at that time are African or Native or African Native mixed people. So what we find as a sign of resistance is that as Africans are running away, they're not running away to the south, they're not running away to Canada at this time. In the 18th century, they're simply running away and hiding in plain sight, and they're leaving one urban seaport and moving into a next urban seaport, and they're signing on in maritime crews on vessels. And in fact, we've been able to look at an inventory of hundreds of runaway ads of colonial New England at that time, and on a consistent basis, you see Africans running away from Newport and hiding in plain sight and living and working on a vessel in Boston, or leaving Nantucket and finding themselves in Providence on a vessel. So what's important to recognize here is that one of the most consistent and successful and sustainable signs of resistance was the ability of Africans who had trade skills and had knowledge of the sea, the ability to pick up, leave an enslaved circumstance, and live a relatively quality life, an 18th century quality life on a merchant vessel, but still a free life or free choice. And we see this consistently as the most important sign of resistance and creative survival of Africans in 18th century New England, and particularly here in Rhode Island at Providence and Newport. But it's really after the American Revolution that things begin to change. Rhode Island by 1784 joins other New England states in putting forth a gradual emancipation of slavery. The last slave would die in 1854 at Jamestown, named Holland. But by the end of the 18th century, most Africans are free in Rhode Island. What we find as free Africans, many of them had access to religion because many were converted during their time. Many had access to trade skills because remember what Governor Josias Linden reminded us. We have bad weather, bad soil, not a lot of cash crops going on here. Most of our farms and plantations were animal husbandry. You have cows and cattle for beef. You have goats for milk and for cheese, lots of corn, but you really don't have the cash crops that are really driving the African enslavement of the West Indies and even the southern part of the Americas. So for the most part, these Africans, they have access to trade skills, and many of them are quite adept at their trade skills, and they use these trade skills as free men and free women. What we also find is that by the end of the American Revolution, Newport as a significant trading port is completely diminished. It's from the blockage of the American Revolution, clearly the influence of British settlement in Newport at that time. So for the most part, Newport ceases to become, by the end of the 18th century, a leading maritime center, industrial center. Providence, though, is now taking off along with Pawtucket and other northern Rhode Island in the Industrial Revolution. So by the end of the 18th century, we start to begin to see free Africans, not only in Newport, but in Connecticut and Massachusetts, relocating to Providence. And as they relocate to Providence, they begin to organize themselves as free Africans. And in fact, some of the earliest free African institutions, organized institutions in America, begin not in Virginia, not in the Carolinas, but in Rhode Island and then later Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. And one of the most important aspects of these Africans as free African people, they see themselves and their institutions as Africans. They do not use the term Black or colored or Negro. In fact, in their letters, they say, that's what whites call us. We are Africans. And as they begin to establish these institutions, they're called African churches, African schools, African lodges. And in 1780, the very first free African society in all of the Americas begins in Newport. A group of African men meet at the home of Abraham Casey, who is a master chocolate grinder serving in the household of Aaron Lopez. And Abraham Casey, along with several other Africans, form and charter the Free African Union Society. Why do we know this? Because the minutes and records of the society still exist within the collections of the Newport Historical Society. And we've been able to interpret those records, which are extraordinary from the perspective that the Africans do three things with the society. One, they become an 18th century census. They take every demographic information they could and what they could find on African people in Newport, from sex, family size, trade, religion, interests, death, life, births, whatever they could find, they would document. It's one of the first truest census taking efforts by an African organization in Newport in the 1780s. The second thing they do is that many of them are African born. And even though they're free, they really want to return to Africa. So they have a strong sense of returning to Africa, not to be sent to Africa by the later American colonization movement, but a free choice of leaving Rhode Island, returning to their homeland, and living the rest of their days in the place where they can live as free Africans. So this Free African Union Society becomes a very important opportunity to define themselves as now Africans in America, not chattel property, not slaves, not Negroes, but Africans in America. And one of the most important aspects of this is, and being a history nerd who loves looking at the records and documentation, it is like a treasure trove to be in Rhode Island, because I can actually read actual primary source diaries, letters, minutes, and documents written by the hand of African men and women. And one of the things that the African Union Society Newport does is sends letters to other free Africans in Providence, Boston, and Philadelphia, encouraging them to form free African societies. And between 1780 and 1790, Newport, followed by Philadelphia, Boston, and Providence, all form free African Union societies, and they're corresponding by letters. They're actually visiting and exchanging notes about how they should organize themselves. One of the most important aspects of this is that every single one of these African societies would evolve by the late 18th century or early 19th century into early Black churches. In the case of Rhode Island, the African Union Society of Newport would later evolve into the Union Congregational Church. In Providence, the African Society would evolve into an African meeting house, which would later become the Cogden Street Baptist Church. The Cogden Street Baptist Church is the oldest existing Black church in Rhode Island. And again, in the cases of Boston and Philadelphia, these free Africans are now not only establishing civic organizations, but they're establishing religious organizations that are Black owned, Black operated, and most importantly, Black managed. And in the case of Providence, the Providence Free African Union Society, we have their records. They are organized by these leading men: London Spear, William Stowes, Bonner Brown, Cudge Brown, that's a day name, Bristol Oney are founding members. And we also know by looking at the primary records that by 1790, at the time that this organization is founded, there are at least 475 people of color living in Providence, free people of color. Now, let me be clear what people of color would have meant at that time. Largely African, some Native, and then anyone of a mixed heritage would almost always been mixed African Native, or sometimes the term mulatto. Where did they live in Providence at that time? They lived to the north of what is present-day College Street, or to the south of present-day College Street. And this is an actual list including the 4 highlighted names of the founders of the African Union Society of Providence, a list of African heritage heads of household, free heads of household, living and working and worshiping in Providence in 1790. Again, as a nerd and a scholar, I have the ability to go in and reconstruct the lives of many of these individual people and their families as compared to the stories of enslavement, the stories of racism and discrimination. I get to reconstruct the lives of proud African heritage people who once lived on Benefit Street and College Street and Meeting Street and Cogden Street and College Hill, and then later Lippet Hill and Mount Hope. So what's important here is that the records that we have give us a window on not only the history of early Providence and Rhode Island, but a window on men and women and families who were largely unknown until this day. And I want to point out what I had said earlier about one of the most important aspects of the early African Union societies was a return to Africa. There was a first effort established in 1773 when Reverend Samuel Hopkins and Ezra Stiles of Newport collaborated on a plan to identify 2 to 3 African men who they would convert to Christianity, educate, and send back to the African continent as missionaries. This is a self-interest by the Protestant Christian community. They're expanding Christianity. But the African men that are identified, a John Camino and a Bristol Yama, are later sent and funded to enroll at what at the time was the College of New Jersey, what today we represent as Princeton University. They are the 2 first African heritage people to enroll in college in America. Unfortunately, their studies are disrupted by that little thing called the American Revolution, and neither one would complete those studies. And in fact, John Camino in 1776 would write a letter to Moses Brown of Providence, thanking him and encouraging him to continue his work in slavery. And if you read here the letter that I've transcribed, this is not the handwriting of a slave or a chattel property. This is a highly educated, highly proud, and highly engaged African man who is thanking a white man for taking the interest and the leadership of pushing forth abolition and equality. Tragically, John Camino signs on to a privateer, like many following the maritime trades, and is killed at sea. His wife and children are buried at God's Little Acre. Now, I'm going to ask one thing, if anyone remembers, you see this image of this African privateer here. Someone later, please ask me the background on this image because it has a very interesting history on its own. There was a second effort, and it was led now by Moses Brown working with Samuel Hopkins in Newport, and it's really led by the Providence African Union Society. And this is actually a transcription of letters, one that comes from Anthony Taylor, who's buried in God's Little Acre and president of the African Society in Newport, sends a letter to his counterparts in Providence saying, you need to join us. We need to come up with a plan to return to Africa. And Bristol Yama, who was going to go years before, now living in Providence, now a member of the African Society of Providence, he and Cato Gardner and James Mackenzie respond to Newport and say, yes, we are excited. Yes, we are looking to involve ourselves and transport ourselves from Rhode Island back to Africa. And in fact, James Mackenzie, as secretary of the African Union Society in Providence, through Moses Brown, takes passage on the Charlotte, which is a trading ship, not a slave trading ship, but a trading ship that sails from Providence to Sierra Leone. He brings with him a letter on behalf of the African Societies of Providence and Newport, requesting the opportunity to send African families from Rhode Island to permanently settle in Sierra Leone. Now, the ship captain was not happy with this, and a number of his letters still exist. And he's complaining because this James Mackenzie is first logged on as a second mate. He doesn't know anything about sailing. He's in the way. The captain's not very pleased, but Moses Brown made it absolutely clear, I paid for his way. You will take him to Sierra Leone. You will treat him decently. When James Mackenzie arrives in Sierra Leone, he meets the governor and the council. He makes the request that he has a group of families willing and ready to immigrate, and he is told that they cannot accept more than a dozen families, but also under the condition that someone white of leading character would support them. Eventually, Mackenzie returns to Rhode Island. He makes the request, and Samuel Hopkins turns him down. So at no time, regardless of the effort of the African Society of Providence, the voyage of Mackenzie, the return, at no time at that time did any Africans relocate from Providence or from Rhode Island to Sierra Leone. The third and final effort in 1826 is led by a group in the Newport Society in conjunction with Providence. It's led by two ancient African men, Newport Gardner or Okama Mariku and Salaba Nubia. And we know because we have their records. And they bring with them sets of families from Newport and Providence who take the sail, not to Sierra Leone, but to Liberia. They arrive on February 6th. We have the records, but nearly all of them die of coastal fever within a year. That might be tragic to some, but on the other hand, they died as free men and free women and families in their own land under their own choice. And as I had said earlier, by the end of the 18th century, you have these very well-organized African communities in Providence and Newport, and particularly Providence. As they're organizing themselves, the Africans of Providence are expanding. They're beginning to build their African schools and other civic institutions. But it's the 19th century that brings a whole new set of challenges to now free African Americans living in Rhode Island, principally in Providence, and significantly in the College Hill East Side. The second part of our presentation next week, we will talk about the existence of these free Africans in the 19th century under the title Separate and Unequal. And during that time, the challenge that they faced were two significant race riots and disruptions in the early 19th century. Their restrictions to the access to vote, their restrictions to have access to public schools, and later, their basic civil rights being challenged after the American Civil War. But part two will give you the next set of information of how African Americans now in Providence and Rhode Island would overcome being separate and unequal. And again, I just want to thank you for listening in. I encourage people to reach out. We're very excited to continue this partnership with the Providence Community Library. We are doing a lot of work through the Rhode Island Black Heritage Study and other institutions that include creating webinars, online exhibits, and we're going to be working over the next several months and even building a K-12 school curriculum so that all school children in Rhode Island will have the opportunity to hear this and so much more history of African heritage people of Rhode Island. So again, thank you for being patient, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Okay, our first question tonight, what made the early freed Africans choose Christianity as a religion as opposed to more traditional African religions or traditions?
That's a great question, thank you. First of all, in the New England case, and particularly in Rhode Island, many of the Africans that arrived here who had survived the Middle Passage and from the West Indies to Rhode Island were relatively young, under the age of 14, in some cases 6 and 7 and 8 years old. So as they arrived here, they were relatively young, they were alone, and once they arrived here, they lived in the same household as master and mistress. It is very rare, in fact, outside of a location in Connecticut and Medford, Massachusetts, where you have separate slave quarters, for the most part, these young Africans lived in the same household as master and mistress. They also worked side by side, learning trade skills. But most importantly, think of the founding of Rhode Island, what we're most proud of, that lively experiment of separation of church and state, that religious freedom would drive the organization of this colony. So nearly all of the whites who lived and worked here, even those who were involved in slave ownership and slave trading, they themselves had a strong sense of religious freedom and choice. And that could have been the Quakers, and certainly the Sephardic Jews that arrived, and many others, and then the Baptist faith, which begins in Providence through Roger Williams. So you have this almost paternalistic system where these young Africans are being brought into the household, and at the same time, by the mid-18th century, there is in the Protestant Christian a great awakening movement that is pushing to a very aggressive conversion of Africans into the Christian faith. In fact, I've had the opportunity of reading the records of Christian, particularly Christian faith across Rhode Island, from Reverend McSparran in Narragansett County to the Anglican and Baptist churches of Newport and Providence. And in the middle part of the 18th century, they're almost competing with each other on how many Africans that they could convert and become Christians and confirm into the church. In fact, we have records, baptismal records by the clergy. So by the middle to the end of the 18th century, a large number of these Africans have converted. What's most important is that by the end of the 18th century, as they begin to become free and establish their own institutions, they really want to establish their own African churches. They want to worship God under their own leadership and under their own belief system. The other point is that, remember what I said before, Africans did not arrive as a blank slate. They brought with them their language, their culture, their tradition, and their religion. One of the hallmarks of African survival in African diaspora that exists today in the Americas is the Black church, and particularly the Black Baptist church. In fact, you have a number of churches today that still have remnants of that African tradition, such as talking loudly or shouting out and being loudly interactive during services. That comes from traditional African religion that has survived 400 years of enslavement, discrimination, and freedom. So thank you. That was a great question.
Next question. It's actually two parts. Does the Congregational Church still stand in Newport, and what is the address? And also, which cemetery in Newport will we find the headstones?
Great. I'll start with the cemetery question. First, they're called burial grounds back then. Cemeteries didn't come into the vernacular until the really antebellum era. But the common burying ground in Newport, which is along appropriately Farewell Street, is one of the largest and earliest common burying grounds, a gift of John Clark by the 1640s to the town of Newport. There are over 6,000 markers there and a large number of colonial governors. In the northwest section, a section was laid out by as early as 1705 as an African burying ground, later to be called God's Little Acre. So today you can come to common burying ground. We have a sign that indicates God's Little Acre, and you can walk carefully and see the markers of enslaved and free Africans and later African Americans of the 19th, early 20th century. As far as the Union Congregational Church, their building still stands as a private residence. It's at 49 Division Street on Historic Hill in Newport. I know this well because my ancestors were a part of that church and I own most of their documents that still exist. The church itself was constructed and completed in 1871 of a Gothic style. The church at the time was at the center of Newport's Black community. It'd be the first of 4 Black churches along the Historic Hill neighborhood. In fact, it's always interesting to me today that when people ask me where did the Black community live in the 18th, 19th century, I'll say, well, Bellevue Avenue, Historic Hill, and the Point neighborhood, which today is more bed and breakfasts and Airbnbs and less residential communities. But at a time, and this is important to recognize, the earliest Black settlements in New England are places like College Hill, Providence, Historic Hill, Newport, and Beacon Hill in Boston.
Do the surnames from the 1790 list reflect formerly enslaved Africans taking the name of their owners, for example, Brown, Manning?
Yes, in the case of Rhode Island, most of the names that you see are reflected from the households that they were enslaved and later lived in. Again, I want to be careful with this because we can't compare colonial slavery and slave trade in New England to the antebellum South and certainly the West Indies. I'm not saying it's better or worse or good or bad. It's a different economic social system. For the most part, enslaved Africans lived in the same household and worshiped within the same places of worship with their white contemporaries. That would have been unlawful and unheard of in the American South and certainly the West Indies. So what that means is that the white community wasn't any more progressive or liberal. It's the Africans that would seize the opportunity through their creative survival by having cohabitation, learning trade skills, learning the English language, being able to have some level of freedom. They would put that into their own benefit, and thus that's why the earliest free Black institutions were established in Providence, Boston, Philadelphia, and Newport, and not Charleston, South Carolina, or Savannah, Georgia.
Let's see. In the 1790 list of names, there are numerous current Providence street names. Does that indicate that they were enslaved by the family of the figure for whom the streets were named?
Well, in history, the winners write the history, and street names reflect some of the leading citizens of that time that were written into the history. Clearly, the transatlantic slave trade was at the center of the 18th century economy of Rhode Island, particularly in the merchant communities of Providence, Bristol, and Newport. But again, those leading families and their wealth was directly tied. And as those families built wealth, they would contribute to the well-being of the community, either building places of worship, building public schools, building colleges such as Brown University. So it's not surprising that many of the street names that we see today are reflected on those founding families whose wealth is very much tied to the transatlantic slave trade. In my community of Newport, I live on Vernon Avenue, next to Vernon Park, down the street from the Vernon Estate. That was established by Samuel and William Vernon, two of the largest slave traders in not only Rhode Island and American history. But I've only lived here for 100 years.
Could African Americans travel freely in Rhode Island in the 18th and early 19th century?
African and indigenous people who were enslaved had to follow very strict slave code requirements. In fact, there is legislation. I own a document from the 1750s that is very much like a Negro code or a slave code that restricts and places curfews on enslaved Africans and indigenous people. It's quite restrictive. Those that are free have some level of freedom, but they still need to be careful. My general sense would be is that if you were an African tradesperson and you had to, at some point, you were doing shipbuilding in Newport, were then being asked with your skills to come to Providence to build a ship in the Cove, then you were able to move freely from Newport to Providence, and then some movement in Providence. But when your trade work was completed, you would return to your master in Newport. So yes, there's a level of movement and a level of connectivity that would have been unheard of and unnecessary and unlawful in the American South and the West Indies, but they still lived restricted lives. Even though we're genteel here in New England and we use the term servant, African and indigenous people were enslaved.
Okay, can you please explain where the painting of the Black Privateer came from?
Thank you, that's my favorite story. That painting comes from the private collection of a Rhode Island family. Back during the bicentennial in 1776, they had acquired that painting from kind of an old shop in Charleston. It was very interesting because they'd never quite seen a picture of an African privateer or an African in colonial, so they bought it. They then had the picture restored, and as the picture was being professionally restored, they found that it was actually a white privateer that someone had painted black. The owner decided that the black color was so unique, I would keep it and had it restored as a black privateer. To this day, that image is used across historical documents, books, as a very, I think, accurate depiction, if not an authentic depiction, of what an African privateer would be. But a very great Rhode Island story, something that you don't quite think exactly what it should be, it needs to be, but today we certainly recognize it as a very accurate depiction of that 21% of African heritage people who also served on sailing vessels during the 18th and early 19th century. So thank you for asking that question.
What percentage of the free Black community in the early 1800s were from Liberia?
For the most part, very few. Well, first of all, most Africans who were free in the 18th and then later in the 19th century under the American Colonization Society Act were being sent initially to Sierra Leone and then later to Liberia. By the early part of the 19th century, most free African Americans are not predisposed of leaving America because their general feeling is that we're now third, fourth generation Americans. We have bled in America. We have survived slavery. We have every right to be here. And by the 1840s and 50s, there was a significant organized resistance of African Americans wanting to return to Africa, or certainly be sent away to Africa from a white perspective. So for the most part, the peak of that immigration is the late 18th, early 19th century, and more so tied to the end of the American Revolution. Certainly those Africans that chose to serve with the British, those that would leave to Canada and Nova Scotia, some would go back to Jamaica, but many others would end up in Sierra Leone or Liberia.
Were burials at God's Laker only for Africans from Newport, or were there any from other towns, specifically Warren or Barrington?
There's a lot of movement, remember, at that time. You have Africans that might be enslaved in Newport, but then later their master and mistress relocates, not only within Rhode Island, but in New England, even back to the West Indies. So for the most part, we've inventoried all the markers that are there. All the Africans that are in Newport have some connectivity to Newport, but they have other family members that we later find them buried elsewhere, not only in Providence, but certainly back into the West Indies and other locations. We do have some Africans that have connections to Providence, to Warren and Bristol, but I have not found a marker of someone who originated in Warren, who might have lived most of their life in Warren, and now is interred in Newport at Godswood Laker. One of the most interesting stories that we have is we have an early marker of a young girl, Mimbo, which is a day name, who dies in 1723, and her marker is actually a duplicate of a marker in Dorchester, Massachusetts. Her master and mistress are actually Dorchester slave merchants and slave owners who actually are doing business in Newport, and our general belief is the child might have died in Newport, was buried in Newport, and then a marker was placed with her larger family of enslaved Africans in Dorchester. That's our conclusion. We don't have the primary documents to evidence that.
You mentioned that Rhode Island was second to Connecticut in African inhabitants. Could you discuss this further?
Well, again, Connecticut's a larger colony. There are larger groups of Africans working in southeastern Connecticut in the plantations farms. You also have larger African settlements in Norwich, Bridgeport as it evolves, and then certainly New Haven and particularly New London. In fact, by the early 19th century, you have communities called Little Goree and Little Liberia, all established in Connecticut. I just want to thank everyone again for taking the time. Please reach out to the Black Heritage Society. Please reach out to myself. This is the tip of the iceberg. We have reams of information and documentation that particularly speak to the voice of African heritage people. Black Lives Matter in 2020 recognizes that Black lives matter, but Black history also matters. Thank you, Providence Community Library. Thank you, Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith, so much on behalf of Providence Community Library and all of you in attendance. That was an amazing presentation.